A lot of permanent residents or people with green cards have been asking me if they can safely travel internationally or if they are taking risks. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. Specifically, I want to start by going back to Trump's first presidency. You may or may not recall that within his first week or two in office, he initiated a Muslim country ban. Basically said if you're from several Muslim majority countries, you're not allowed to enter the United States. And that included permanent residents. People with physical green cards were being turned around in the airport and put back on flights to their home countries. Pretty quickly, within a couple of days, a US District Court judge reversed this finding and determined that permanent residents are not allowed to be denied entry into the United States and that they have an absolute right to re-enter the United States. This was the first time a president had directly challenged the rights of permanent residents to be allowed back into the United States, and the court case clearly defines that permanent residents are always allowed back into the United States as long as they are permanent residents and they meet other requirements. So let's talk about what that means in several different contexts. Before I get into specifics, I just want to start by saying as a permanent resident, you can absolutely be denied re-entry into the United States. And we're going to talk about several times where that can happen. But generally speaking, if you're permanently residing in the US, you have no criminal history, no major issues, and you don't leave the United States for too long, you will almost always be allowed back into the US. And if you fall into that scenario and you have no other immigration problems and you're otherwise eligible, you shouldn't worry about being denied re-entry into the United States. But when might it be concerning, and when should you worry a little bit about re-entering the United States? Well, the first scenario, and this is the obvious one, is for criminal history. There are some crimes that make you straight up deportable. There are other crimes that make you inadmissible. And these are the tricky ones because inadmissible crimes will not trigger anything from immigration until you leave and you try to re-enter the United States. And all the people watching who are permanent residents who have some sort of old criminal charge or arrest that was dismissed probably already know that every time they try to re-enter the US, the customs officer gets red flagged, they pull you to the side and they ask you questions about it, and then they let you back into the US after they determine that the criminal charges were dismissed and that you are not actually inadmissible. But the way it could turn out if you are inadmissible is they'll pull you to the side, they'll send you to a back room, and then after a series of questioning, they will issue a notice to appear in immigration court, or they'll ask you to sign a form to voluntarily abandon your green card. I'll say it now, and I've said it in other videos, you should never sign Form I-407 without speaking with an immigration attorney first. Do not just listen to what the customs officer tells you. It is not true that you will be able to very easily get a green card again if you sign the form, and that the consulates look very favorably upon people who voluntarily sign the form, and it goes a long way when you're applying for a new visa or green card at the consulate. I've seen situations where people have tried to re-enter the US and the customs officer pressures them into signing Form I-407, and the customs officer says something like, if you sign this form, it'll go a long way at the consulate when you apply for a new visa or your new permanent residence. It should be pretty easy, just sign this form, get a lawyer and do it. Then they sign the form, they get a lawyer, me, and it's time for us to apply for the new visa or permanent residence, and we run into roadblocks. Whether they're inadmissible or there's some sort of bar issue or some other problem that makes it difficult for them to become a permanent resident again. And I only wish they would have consulted with me before they made the crucial mistake of signing Form I-407 in the airport. Okay, now you might be thinking, I don't have any criminal history. I don't care about people who have criminal history. What are other ways where I could encounter problems if I try traveling with my green card? Well, a common way that people have difficulty re-entering the US is when they depart the United States for too long. So if you depart the US for more than 6 months continuously, it can, and probably will, affect your timeline for naturalization to become a US citizen. But forget about that for a second. What actually puts your risk of losing your green card is departing the US for more than 1 year continuously. There's a presumption that you've abandoned your green card if you depart the US for more than 1 year continuously. But if you actually did depart the US and you're outside of the US right now and it's been more than a year, there might be ways you can re-enter the US and be able to salvage your permanent residence. I've made videos on this in the past. The short answer is it all comes down to your intent. Did you intend to spend more than 1 year out of the US? Oh, you had a health problem or there was some circumstance outside of your control? That might be an exception, and you might still be able to maintain your permanent residence and come back even more if more than 1 year has passed. But generally speaking, if more than 1 year has passed, there's a presumption that you've abandoned your green card and you might have problems when you try to re-enter in the airport. The way it could actually play out is an immigration officer will take you into a back room. It's called secondary inspection, and they'll interview you to see what was your actual intent for departing the US for that long. Specifically, did you actually intend to spend that long outside of the US, or were you outside of the US through circumstances that were outside of your control? If they determine that it was your intent to spend that long outside of the US and you refuse to sign Form I-407, they could issue a notice to appear in immigration court and begin your removal proceedings from the US. But that's not the worst thing in the world, because it'll allow a judge to hear your story, to hear what your intent was, and at that point you should immediately lawyer up and prepare for your eventual removal proceedings so that you can prepare a solid defense. The final situation that I want to discuss in today's video for how you can be denied re-entry into the US as a permanent resident applies more to elderly people in my experience, or people who spend really long periods of time outside of the US in a given year. So yes, if you depart the US for more than 6 months continuously, it can affect your timeline for naturalization. And if you depart for more than 1 year continuously, it can affect your ability to re-enter the US because you may have actually abandoned your green card. But what about situations, and I see this all the time with elderly people, where you enter the US and you're here for 1 month, and then you leave the US for 5 months. And then you come back for 1 month, and then you leave for 5 months. And you just do this in perpetuity for years on end. Well, eventually, a customs officer might stop you in the airport and ask you where you are actually living. Because to be a permanent resident, you must be permanently residing in the United States. You cannot be just using your green card as a glorified tourist visa. If you're spending 90% of your year outside of the US, it would be very fair for a customs officer to ask you, where are you working? Where are you permanently living? Where do you receive mail? Where do you maintain your bank accounts? Where do you have your car insurance? Like all of these general questions, and there could be 100 other questions. The purpose of these questions is to determine whether you actually currently intend to reside within the United States, or whether you're actually living in India and you're just traveling back and forth for 2 months a year to visit friends and family in the United States, which would support the officer's theory that you're using your green card as a glorified tourist visa. So to bring the question back to where we started at the beginning of this video, let's say that you properly received your green card and you have no criminal history, and there's no argument that you've ever engaged in immigration fraud or lied on any applications, and you've departed the US only once in the last few years, and the purpose of the travel was to be a tourist in some other country, and you came back within 6 weeks. In this scenario, you're not going to be denied re-entry into the US absent some exceptional circumstance that might be outside of your control. You should, under these facts, be allowed back into the US, and I would be absolutely surprised if you're ever denied re-entry under these circumstances. Generally speaking, permanent residents have the absolute right to live, work, and re-enter the United States There are some exceptions that I discussed in this video, and this video doesn't cover everything, but it covers the majority of the situations that I've seen in my practice as an immigration attorney. If you guys have any questions after watching this video, you could always schedule a consultation directly with me. My name is Pouyan Darian. I'm an immigration attorney and we handle cases nationwide. I focus on family-based immigration, especially marriage cases where you're marrying a US citizen after you've entered with a visa. I also focus on naturalization and deportation defense. If you're interested in any of these services, feel free to reach out, schedule a consultation. I would love to speak to you about your case. If you're interested in staying up to date on family-based immigration, naturalization, immigration court stuff, and Trump's changes to immigration policies, be sure to subscribe. I'll put out several videos each week on these topics, and I'll see you guys next time for another video.